Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, everybody. I think we could just get started. It seems like most people show up right on time to this meeting, so I don't think we need to wait any more minutes. So hi, everyone. As always, if you could sign in to the meeting notes, which I just pasted in the chat, and also a reminder that by participating, you're agreeing to the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct. We have one agenda item on the list from Mike. I could also give a brief update on the SLSA v1.0. If you have any other topics, just please add it to the agenda. Mike, you want to get started?
Sure. So yeah, so I think based on a couple of things that I saw both at KubeCon as well as just some general confusion in the Slack and some other areas, there seem to be folks who are a little confused by the build service requirement in SLSA for level 3, specifically saying that the build service should be the thing that's sort of generating and signing the provenance. And so I put in the notes my thoughts about it, and to just kind of go through them quickly. So one of the things I started to notice is a lot of folks are confusing the concept between like a workload identity and the build service signing a thing. So for folks who are not super familiar with workload identity, that's stuff like, hey, you're assigning an identity to a single build, let's say, in this context for SLSA, where you're just sort of saying, using something like, let's say, Spiffy Spire, or in GitHub, I believe each individual GitHub run has its own sort of unique identity. And so that it kind of helps protect against sorts of attacks that could be, you don't have long running credentials for a single build to lots of other services, and that it should also include like signing secrets and those sorts of things. Now, I think where people are getting confused is they're thinking that the build service piece, just that requirement just means like, oh, you should be using a short-lived key. And I think, to be clear, I think like something like a workload identity and an ephemeral sort of signing secret is still valuable, like whether it's Sigstore keyless or Spiffy Spire or any of that sort of stuff is still really good. However, I also think that that doesn't really hit what's being talked about in the SLSA 3 requirement, which is that the build service should be the thing doing the signing. And so the intent of that requirement, from my understanding, has always been that the build service, so something like GitHub Actions itself, or through a reusable workflow, or through Tecton chains, or doing something like through checked-on chains, you actually have that looking at what's happening in the building, in the build, introspecting the build and whatever, and then generating the provenance and then signing it, with the purpose being that we don't want to have the build generate its own provenance and sign its own provenance, because obviously a build is potentially where the user-defined actions are happening. It's very arbitrary what's actually happening in there. And you kind of want to have that in a separate trust domain or a security domain. And so I think that's kind of where a lot of that confusion is. And the other thing I just want to add on there is it does still sound like something like ephemeral keys or workload identities is still probably something that either we recommend, or we when we look at the other requirements for saying a secure build system, we might say, hey, look for secure build systems that use stuff like workload identities. But I just wanted to make sure that, like, what could we do to make that much clearer, because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. Mark.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing, and Sean had also suggested something nice too, like if we could somehow introduce into the specification, both the provenance spec and the core SLSA spec, the idea of like trust domains or security boundaries or something like that. I think that's like the big thing. It seems to be that's the big thing that's missing, that like, if we could better explain that, I think, and have a visualization for what that looks like, I think that'll help a lot. I think that's maybe one outcome of this discussion. I know we also had some others, SLSA 1.0, what's it called? The dashboard. I raised an issue before of like, is that SLSA 3 or not? So like if GitHub has effectively GitHub and Sigstore in this case, combined, you get an X509 certificate that says this artifact really was produced by this workflow, and the security boundary is the workflow. Does that meet level 3?
Yeah, so I mean, I think generally that sort of thing, it probably does. I do think that there's still, I know one of the big, and this is kind of maybe something also for the tooling team to take a look at, which is like, ideally, as much of that information, we need to, I think, find some consistent patterns for doing it, because the other thing that we don't want to have is we don't want to, let's say, encode a ton of information directly, let's say, in, and I know some folks have been talking about this, is, you can encode a lot of this information directly in the X509, as opposed to generating provenance and then signing that provenance about that thing. And I just think that that also makes it harder to then ingest that information and make make an assertion like that, because if certain information about if there's certain provenance information that's encoded directly in the signing secret, then if I'm a user of provenance, I don't know, it becomes a little bit more difficult to know, like, hey, do I expect all the information directly in the provenance? Do I expect some of this information to be verified through the actual signing secrets, or what?
Yeah, I feel like we should split of like recommended implementation versus the actual requirements. Like I could see why we would recommend having a standard format, et cetera. I think from a requirements perspective, if someone implements it using the X509 certs, I could see that. But like so I linked this issue 321 I put in the meeting notes. That if like, does this Sigstore thing satisfy SLSA 3 or not? Like if you call Sigstore in using the GitHub Actions OIDC token and get a Sigstore X509 certificate that has the identity of the workflow in it, is that good enough for SLSA 3? It's hard because, like, we're quantizing things that is kind of a continuum. I am inclined to say, like, it seems like it does meet the requirements, that, you basically have a guarantee that this workflow definitely generated this artifact because no other run would have been able to get access to the signing key, unless that workflow were somehow compromised, which, like, the code itself that it's running has some vulnerability, which I think is out of scope for SLSA. Mike.
Yeah, so I think that last thing you said, like, answers the question, which I think the answer is generally yes, because I think, if I look at the intent, if I go back to sort of the intent of the requirement is to make sure that an end user build, which is arbitrary actions, right? That could be, if that's the thing that's getting compromised, then it could essentially lie about everything else. Whereas if you have it separate and you are controlling that in a different way, then you get the benefit of saying, like, hey, I can use, whether it's chains or whether it's the GitHub reusable workflows, I can go and say, well, yeah, I'm using that has access, and all it's doing is introspecting on the build, and then, or, pulling inputs or whatever and generating the provenance and then signing that. And that's all it's doing. And the end user has no ability to do that. None of the actual the compilation, no other, any of those sorts of steps actually have the ability to affect that. I think it meets that requirement. I think, as you sort of mentioned there also earlier, is like, we might make particular recommendations just from like hey, generally doing it this way is safer than that way, but I think they're both hitting the requirement. And I also think that, like, because I also think about it, if I go back to, like, chains definitely hits that requirement, but you also still have the same issue, right? Where if chains gets hacked, well, then, you're still, then you're generating bad provenance anyway. And I think it's the same thing here with a reusable workflow. Like, if somehow GitHub itself is hacked where, the reusable workflow is not doing what you expect it to, then you still have that same problem. And so I think it hits that. I think it does hit all the requirements there.
Maybe one question we asked was, like, what would be an example of something that's level 2 but not level 3?
So, I mean, I think when I've seen this a bunch is I've seen a lot of folks in GitHub Actions where they just have a set of GitHub Actions that are all controlled by the project itself. And, they have step 1, pull down dependencies, step 2, run the build, step 3, use cosign to sign that using something like a workload identity, and step 4, push that out. And I think that itself is level 2, but not level 3, because the end user can go and modify that. Because a lot of these things are actually happening in the same like trust domain and whatever, like, there's significantly more areas where it could be attacked. And in certain cases, I've actually just seen a build script, and part of that build script is cosign, yada, yada, in which case you're literally running it as part of the like the same step you're doing the compilation. And so all it takes is, let's say, for example, the NPM stuff, you download an NPM package, that NPM package on installation goes and says, I'm going to steal all your secrets. It takes the secrets from the GitHub action and, signs whatever it wants. Yeah, Aaron?
Yeah, and that, you guys remember the demo I did with the GitLab piece. So I think that's the example of level 2 versus level 3, because GitLab is the build service that's actually generating the provenance without interaction from the end user. However, it's not signed. So I had to create a job, right? That's from the end user in the CI that's doing cosign sign on that provenance document. So it's not the best, right? And that's actually that merge request that I did where I was very specific about level 2 versus level 3, right? It's level 2 is like, hey, we have something that's like better than nothing, but it's also potentially able to be tampered with because of the end user, or the, the end user, the ability to change that signature later on.
So this is, I forget, was this using GitLab secrets?
Yeah, so this would use like the GitLab CI variable, because I wasn't doing keyless either. I was just using a private key in the CI variable that was masked, and to do the cosine signature.
I see. So like using like kind of like secrets that are locked down to only be accessible to the
Right, so
workload.
it's accessible to like the CI job, but it's also technically, the end user could script any job they want using that secret in a way, unfortunately. So I'm not a huge fan of the way that it's happening. That's why I'm kind of pushing on GitLab to do the signature in the build service as well, and they're working on that, which is nice.
So one thing I also heard from that is that there's two separate pieces, right? There is the having a build service generate the provenance and having a build service sign the provenance, right? Which I think is really important to make sure is clear, because like the generation of the provenance means you can't have a malicious developer or a some part of the build generate fake provenance without at least you having some insight into what happened, right? Whereas, the things that when I look at the other way, right, you have the build service doing this. The build service is getting a set of inputs. It's like all it's doing is parsing that set of inputs and forwarding it along. And so on. And to Josh's point, I think, like, just to be clear, yeah, I agree with you that like if a service generates it, but you don't know if the service doesn't also sign it, then how do you know? And how do you know it hasn't been tampered with between the time the service had generated it and signed it? So I do think that those things are closely linked. I just think that they are separate in the sense that you can generate provenance without signing it, but you still need to sign it. And also that generally if you sign it with like if you need to do both in order to hit it, is what I mean. Yeah. You can't just do one and have the other sign it, or generate one and then have the service sign it, because you'll still run into that same issue. Mark?
I guess, so like the workload identity, it's still not clear to me what requirement does it not meet? And if there is no such requirement, but it's desirable that we want to like call that level 3, but not level 2, or if we say that shouldn't be level 3, then what requirement would it be?
Oh, I mean, I think this is, so when I think about workload identities, I think about you are essentially securing that a particular thing is at least spun up, doing what it was spun up to do. And yes, something could have, executed into that environment and is tampering with it, or something that you don't realize is in that environment could be doing something that you don't expect. So when I think about the workload identities and I think about the service generation piece, right, that doesn't hit the service generation piece directly, or it doesn't hit it because it still doesn't prevent something like somebody executing in to an environment and modifying the modifying provenance or generating bad provenance, and then using, if it's signing with its own workload identity, right, or something like that. Like, for example, if you give a particular GitHub action direct access to, like through something like Sigstore and keyless to sign using the OIDC token, like, that only that one build is like, you don't worry. It's a separate concern. Like, you're not worried that somebody has stolen a credential that they can then use to now sign whatever they want, but they still have signed a bad build.
I think maybe I'm a little bit confused, I guess. on what specifically you're talking about here. So the workload identity versus build service signing. If something has client-side tooling, like let's say there's a workflow that does the OIDC to SigStore thing, gets a signing cert from SigStore and uses whatever to generate and sign provenance all within the workflow. Like a client-side tooling. Like for example, NPM is talking about baking this into the NPM client. Are you suggesting that would be level 2 or level 3?
I would be suggesting largely that sounds like level 2 to me. And the reason being is if I have an arbitrary build environment, right? And like just as an example, the NPM thing, right? If I download one of those NPM malicious packages that steals credentials or whatever, right? Like one of those things that, you know, on installation time runs a thing, what is to prevent that NPM tool, like, you know, so when I run NPM install, what's to prevent that malicious package from generating salsa provenance, signing it with my workload identity, and pushing that out?
So to play devil's advocate, what is stopping that at level 3?
So I think the thing that's stopping that from level 3, when I look at it from a service thing, the service, if you have secured the service, right, which is something that you should just be doing to begin with, right? And there's an expectation that whatever is orchestrating the builds is like, you know, relatively secure. And because that build service is not the thing running the arbitrary actions, right? You're not installing, you know, you're not running npm install on the node that's running the build service, right? The build service is potentially audited and yada, yada. Because you're doing that, then there's less of a worry that you are, you know, there's less of a worry that, for example, if I'm running Tecton chains, that Tecton chains itself gets compromised. Or if I'm running GitHub, that GitHub actions itself is compromised.
Is a concern with like a short-lived signing certificate versus like a signing service? Like if instead you called SigStore and received a signature, like you give it a hash and you get it back a provenance versus instead you call it and you get an X509 cert that you then call. Would that?
Well, so I'm thinking about it a little bit differently. I'm thinking about it purely from the perspective of who is allowed to generate the provenance, right? Like, is the build service essentially introspecting on what the end user is doing to then say, yep, these are the inputs I got to the build, so this is what I'm signing for the build provenance, versus having an end user's, like what's under an end user's control, or potentially under, like if you download a malicious package, that could go in and say, hey, I installed these packages that it didn't install. You know what I mean? Or it included materials that are not, you know, that weren't being, that it wasn't told to as part of the GitHub action.
Yeah, I'd be interested if any other folks have thoughts on this. My inclination would be to call that level 3 because it's not clear like what requirement I would point to say that why that's not. Like the distinction seems unclear to me between that and level 3 because effectively the bits of the provenance are embedded in the X509 cert in this particular SigStore case. Like the things that are required at level 3 are embedded in there. The entry, like the top level input / I think in the VO2 it's called, what's it called? Config source is effectively embedded in X509 cert. The list of dependencies and stuff or materials is not a requirement in level 3 anyway, and so that one could be untrustworthy.
So I guess so I have a question. So I guess when it comes to, and I know that this is out of the scope of the spec itself, but more from the perspective of like a usability piece. So because it's embedded in the X509, I agree with you. Like it can't be falsified. However, what happens if you end up with provenance that like is there a concern here? Because we need to make sure that the end user whoever's consuming the provenance knows that the X509 is the thing to verify it against versus the provenance itself. Right, because you could end up in a situation, right, where if you do have a compromised build, the compromised build might be generating bad provenance, or like bad provenance, like a bad predicate, right? It would be generating a bad predicate, but the X509 would say, well, no, hold on. The X509 would not map back to the predicate, but the end user would then need to know that it has to check that.
Yeah, I think that
Oh, yeah, that's good.
any sort of SIG store based thing has to do that, right? Because we have this. And that's why I feel like it's a little bit weird in our current thing that like it's basically listed twice. And you have to verify that the thing listed in the X509 cert matches the stuff in the provenance. And then it says like, well, why is it even in the payload if it's already in their certificate chain? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And I guess my other just open question to anybody else is would there be like, have we specified enough in it to make sure that it's clear, either you need to have a build service that asserts these things and signs the provenance in this way and doesn't allow the end user build to sign it, or you need to have enough information in the workload identity to or you need to have enough stuff in the workload identity to sort of essentially say that this thing couldn't have signed something bad. Like, I think we just need to make that clear, because I'm not, and to be clear, I'm not sure if there's enough, like if there's enough stuff where everything that would be required from level 3 provenance could be encoded directly in the workload identity, then I think it's fine, right? I think then, yes, it absolutely does hit L3, but if there's anything missing, then it doesn't. Yeah. But I'd be curious to also if anybody else has any additional thoughts there.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Like, I guess maybe an assumption. I have been assuming workload identity means effectively everything that is required by level 3. Yeah. Any other pens, or most people are just like, okay, that was a long 30-minute conversation. Okay, yeah, I think
I agree with the conclusion. That's all I have to add.
Yeah, I really want to make this more clear, because I feel like there's so much of this stuff where like people have different notions in their head. There's kind of edge cases. If we could at least have like worked examples or something, that would be good.
Yeah, and for folks who are interested, I'm pretty sure this is also going to be a topic on Friday's tooling meeting, just because like this sort of thing, right, as we're talking about consuming, since we're talking about consuming provenance, right, a lot of the provenance tools will have to make that distinction. We'll have to make that distinction about like, hey, if I pull down provenance, you should also check to see if those claims are being made in, in the signing cert in some way.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on this? Okay. Anything more, Mike?
No, I don't think so. Well, the only other thing, which is just something that, in addition, which is just, and it sounds like it might be better suited for the the generic requirements of like, hey, this sort of assumes you have a reasonable build system that is secure, right? And those sorts of things. I think some of that workload identity is still things that like we probably, I don't know if we want to make those direct suggestions, but is something that we want to make sure of is because I think stuff like ephemeral keys or sorry, ephemeral signing secrets are still good for other reasons beyond just the non-falsifiability piece. Like some of it's just also the fact that, hey, that let's say your build system was potentially compromised between, during this week, then that builds that happened during that week were the things that got compromised. You don't need to revoke the root cert, that kind of thing.
Great. So I could give a quick update on some SLSA 1.0 work. Let me present. Wish I could see my preview of what I'm actually presenting. Is the meeting notes being presented right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. There's no visual indication of which window I'm presenting. Okay, I can see my little 10 pixel preview moving whenever I scroll, so that's good. So the three main updates that have happened in the last week, there was, which again, as always, I'm just saying I'm submitting them in order to move things along, but always happy to take comments, and we'll do a final review at the end. One is around framing levels around tamper protection. The main gist is, let me open the preview. The main gist is to say that at level 1, like that level 1 is about preventing mistakes, but like it's pretty easy to bypass. Level 2 is about requiring some sort of explicit attack, but it's still kind of easy to perform. It's a deterrence, either for unsophisticated adversaries or like you could get fired, for example, from doing something like that. Like clearly you're trying to evade some sort of control. And it does have real security value, although it's far from bulletproof. And then level 3 is that forging the provenance or evading the verification requires some difficult attack that's beyond the capabilities of most adversaries. This is pretty wishy-washy, but I feel like after lots and lots of discussion, that's kind of what differentiates the levels and the main purpose. And the rest of it just kind of follows from that. And so that is this particular change. I'll just go through all these changes. Happy to hear comments on them, or as always, comments. If you want to just comment directly on the pull request, that's fine, and I could do follow-up ones or start an issue either way. The second one was to create this key principles doc, which is, we need a better intro here. But the main thing of like trust systems verify artifacts to lay down, we have no choice but to manually verify a system, but we can automatically verify all the artifacts created by that. That we trust anchoring code, not individuals, because one of the main kind of pushback of also would be like, well, I trust all these people, like they're doing the right thing, which is fine if you if you know those 3 people. But when you're talking about large organizations, either like a third party where I don't know these individuals, or like in a large organization where you have like hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or 100,000 people, it's no longer scalable to like trust individuals. And then prefer attestations over just inferences of like, well, the thing was configured this way, so I assume nothing bad could have happened, but instead we want explicit attestation of like, this good thing did happen, as opposed to, I don't think a bad thing could have happened. So feel free to read that. As always, feedback is welcome. And then I think we mentioned at a previous meeting, I put out a draft to get feedback on a 1.0 for the provenance format. It's still like there's a bunch of to-dos in here. And like I didn't create it in Markdown. I did it in like protobuf. And so like it doesn't look pretty. But I'd be interested in getting people's thoughts. Originally, I was going to push this off until after the spec 1.0 release, but I've had a bunch of conversations with folks where there's a lot of confusion around like, what is a config source? What is an entry point? You know, what are the security boundaries? And hopefully this is maybe getting towards an improvement. The big thing, again, brought up by Mike and by Sean, that's missing right now is like somehow defining like what these trust domains or security boundaries, or I don't know what to call them. I don't even know how to picture it really. If we could do some sort of visualization, I think that would help a lot. But the notion is that we have the build has some sort of top level inputs that are like the independent inputs to the build. And these are the things that the verifier has to like assume match what you expect. There's a list of other optional things. I assume this would be optional at level 3, maybe at level 4, we would require this of like resolved dependencies. And then some sort of per run details of like who ran the build, what timestamps, et cetera. That hopefully have a better separation of concerns around everything. So yeah, Mike.
Yeah, so one thing after giving it a bunch of thought, I think one of the key goals of this that I think just needs to be made sure that's really clear, but I think this is getting us there, is that idea of and I don't know if we want to put it in as a requirement or whatever, but there should be enough information inside of a predicate that somebody could rebuild the thing if they had access to everything there, right? Like the idea here is you should be describing enough information that if you could pull down the config and the code, right? Because in certain cases it's open source, in certain cases it's going to be closed source, in certain cases, you know, you don't have access to whatever they have access to. But assuming you did, you should be able to rerun this build. I think that's kind of the thing that's yeah. Oh, Mark, you're talking on mute there.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think we have this piece here, like it should contain all the information that's necessary and sufficient to run the build. Yeah, any feedback on this? I marked the pull request as draft because it's not ready to submit. But by the way, like ideally we would have something like defining a schema in Markdown sucks. But I haven't found any good language to do this. Proto seems like a decent compromise because like it's nice syntax of like I could do message versus like what is it called? JSON schema is horrible to write by hand. And then with like a bunch of Markdown and like JSON or YAML seems terrible too. So what I'm hoping is that we could just parse this file and just turn it into Markdown, like take all this, you know, all this stuff, have something like, and there's tools that do this, turn it into a JSON, which we can then render as a template or something like that. So if anyone's into that, that'd be great. Because right now it's not very readable seeing it as comments. But yeah, to the actual content area comment, yeah, I think that's, and we should be clear of like whether that's I guess at level, is there a difference between the levels and is that necessary? Like, does it have to describe all of the inputs. Because that's actually maybe a change from the 0.1 release, which is that we said at level 3, you just have to list the entry points and the entry point without really defining exactly what that is. And in level 4, you have to define all the input parameters. And there's some comment on the thread of like, well, entry point's actually pretty confusing. And I'm actually wondering, should we just require at level 3, what Mike said, it's all of the inputs.
So, yeah, I don't exactly know where we should have it, because I think there's a lot of open questions about also trying to make it as like make that on ramp onto the higher levels as easy as is possible. Like at some point we do need to absolutely require that. I also do think that like if we, let's say, do require it, like there's ways to trivially implement it, and I'm also thinking, does any of that defeat the spirit of the requirement? Like if I just said, hey, I took a snapshot of the container, right? At the end of this, I took a snapshot of the container that contained everything I needed. And I gave you that hash, but there's essentially no way to pull that down, that information, you know, there's no way for you to get access to that container that contained those dependencies. Is that like essentially defeating the spirit of the thing there? But also I could imagine, right, like taking a snapshot, and let's say in the case of open source, taking a snapshot of that image, of the build image that includes the dependencies, and all you need to do is just run, you know, GCC or run make or whatever, and it does everything else. And it doesn't, like, that's kind of you've enclosed a hermetic kind of environment. Then, you know, that's also awesome, right? Because then folks can look at what's in there and be able to poke around with it as much as they need to for audit or investigation purposes. Mark?
Yeah, I think that then gets into the transitive thing of like, I think that would be a perfectly fine thing to do, but it would kind of beg the question, since you'd have to know, well, okay, what's the provenance of that container? And yeah, it's kind of pushing it down the road. Okay. Oh yeah, and I'm working on like the split of like maintainer requirements versus like build requirements versus ecosystem requirements. That's what I'm working on next. Okay, we have 15 minutes left. I'm happy hearing more things, but I want to make sure we have time for Tracy. Tracy?
Hi, folks. Yeah, just a quick recap on the SLSA conformance programmer. A while back, long before KubeCon and stuff, we had a call where Jason Litz and Josh from Red Hat presented on an overview of the conformance program. And one of the conclusions was that this was the best meeting to help nurture that and drive that forward. And yeah, I think based on the earlier conversation, that definitely applies. So yeah, I just wanted to get it on the agenda today. I think today the main thing is just raising awareness and highlighting this GitHub issue that's going to track things. I think the main thing we'll want to work to is a concrete proposal that goes to the OpenSSF governing board. But I think there's lots to be ironed out on the way there. So no specifics, but yeah, I would like to make steady progress at this meeting. And yeah, I'm helping just to bridge the gap on the documentation side and process side, but I'll say Jason and Josh are doing the heavy lifting and coordinating that. So maybe over to them for any additional comments.
Yeah, this is Jason. Yeah, we'd definitely like to re-engage on this and keep it on the radar. But again, you mentioned a lot of the details are being hammered out. But yes, the conformance ticket is 515, and it's tied to some of the other issues that are related to this. And so Josh and I probably should kind of probably do a presentation again, or depending on how this group wants to address that, but we can definitely present what we are proposing as a conformance program. Part of that.
Joshua, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to remark on the conformance proposal document. I read it earlier today. I missed the meeting where it was first presented. I really like the idea, but I'm kind of the third party assessment aspect I'm a little wary of at this stage. So I'm curious what sort of timeline you imagine working towards with kind of tier 1, tier 2 establishing processes and things.
Yeah, I don't think we have a timeline, and I think it's safe to say we could also split it up and just do the proposal on a self-audit. So yeah, totally open to feedback from folks. And yeah, I think the more we dig into it, the more it does seem to have, yeah, there's lots of specific things we'll need to address. So yeah. I'm not sure if that helps, but that's generally the thinking. We can do it as 2 stages of just say the plan is we'd like to get to third party, but I don't think we can get there until we're successfully seeing some self audits and reviewing them in the community coming through.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, not least of all because I think if I look at the few public instances of people claiming like conformance to SLSA level 3 and 4 today, I think it's going to be hard to define a good assessment for the third-party assessors. So I think the phased approach and seeing the shape of SLSA 1 and how people are self-assessing SLSA 1 will really inform how we define the requirements for the third-party assessment at tier 2.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. And I'd be happy we can modify that now and just mention that the phased approach, that makes a lot of sense to me. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So just a quick comment. Yeah, I think it makes sense to have this here. And then separately, I do think that maybe once in a while, having some representative who's been working on the conformance work to also show up to the tooling meeting, because I know one of the big things is as we're going through the tooling stuff, we want to also make sure that, especially in the open source tooling, that like, because there's the 2 pieces. One is like conformance as a project, and then there's probably also conformance as a build system. Or like different tools might be conformant to different things, like hey, this hits these requirements. And I know we wanted to kind of like, there's a lot of uncertainty in the tooling meeting. A lot of folks are confused as to like, hey, are we certifying, for example, like GitHub as a build, GitHub Actions as a build system? And if that's the case, do you certify like Tecton and Tecton chains as a build system? And then do you certify this installation of Tecton and Tecton chains? And I know there's been some confusion around that as well that we want to clear up.
Sounds good. I'll take a note. Yeah, we should definitely do that tour. Good.
Yeah, I think we should also figure out like what is a blocker. We should decide in this group what is a blocker for 1.0 and what is not. I suspect getting the whole thing set up is like going to take too long for 1.0. Like already, everything is taking too long for 1.0.
Is there a timeline for 1.0?
I mean, we wanted to release it months ago.
Okay.
So I guess sooner is better.
I know that feeling.
I would suspect that like defining the idea, having some survey in place, and saying like what things are certified, what things are not, like addressing Michael's suggestion, we need to do. I do wonder if we could continue to iterate on the survey over time, that like we don't have, I'm worried about having to get everything right perfectly the first time, right? Because it's impossible to ever get anything right the first time. And so if we could have something where we could start with something that's good enough and then evolve it, would be valuable. And I don't know if we want to time those to the SLSA releases of like we do a 1.1, a 1.2, or we do some sort of rolling thing. I don't know what the best plan is, but trying to figure out like how we evolve it over time, because we're going to get better at it over time, and trying to figure out that like, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And one of the things to decide in the certification is how we tie it to the releases. So if you certify against 1.0, does that apply? Does that not expire? But if the version changes, you need to recertify and things like that. So just, I guess, articulating the relationship between them. And then I think what you say makes a lot of sense. Just we can always fix things in future releases and tighten them up. So let's not do the perfection as the enemy of good.
Yeah, we should also, as part of this, it's not listed in the checklist in 515, but we need to like, I don't know whether it's here or in the higher level task. But like, we need to figure out like where in the requirements do we stick this, right? That like that you have to do this, and like, how does that like just mechanically fit in? Like, how do you, in what format do you publish the survey? Is anything okay? How do we verify this exists? Like, what is the process for verifying this? Of like, it seems like probably in practice we will have one certifying body, which is the SLSA framework, because we have the SLSA verifier tool, and so that comes with a default list of things that it can verify, right? You could like verify GitHub Actions, and I think people are working on Google Cloud Build and GitLab and etc. And so I think just de facto, there is some list where some people have made a decision of like, well, this thing is like the conversation we had for the first half hour, this thing is level 3 or this thing is level 2. And, you know, if we could work that in of like, just explaining that that's the current state, I think that would be good. And then also talk about, well, you know, that's where we are today, where we want to be is this.
Yeah, agree, but nothing specific to add. Okay. Yeah, nothing else on that, but yeah, thanks for that feedback. And I say we'll try to just keep progressing it in this meeting and have some follow-ups next time.
Great. Do you need anything from anyone?
No, I think just take a look at the docs if you haven't, and ask all the questions because they're super valuable.
Are folks starting, because like one of the things listed in 515 was the like create this survey. Has anyone started actually putting something like that together?
Not that I know of, but Joshua Mulliken and I can take that as an action item to start putting that together, and perhaps we can present that to the group. Looks like Chris has got a draft.
Great, yeah, maybe Chris and Jason, you could reach out and
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good.
Great. Any other topics for today? Last minute things with. No? Okay. All right. Well, it's good seeing everyone, and see you in either future meetings or talk to you online. Bye, everybody.